tonight, you guys should have gotten a flyer in an email from me. Back in January, a dear friend of mine named Thomas Pavlik, who worked in IT here at Life University, passed away unexpectedly. It was all very sudden, but he was the bass player for our faculty band. We have kind of a little rock band that we put together called Extra Credit, and he was our bass player. Thomas is one of the most positive, most motivated, most uplifting people that I've ever known. And he loved the band. He loved making music. And we couldn't think of a better way to honor him and his memory than putting on a concert. So we're going to do that this coming Friday at 7:30 in the main gym across the street. So if you guys are free, if any of you are free and are inclined to come out and listen to some good music and honor Thomas, we'd love to have you. So it's going to happen. And that was the purpose of that flyer, so just kind of giving you a heads up. If you want to join us, it's going to be a really good time. We're going to remember him, but we're also going to have a good time. That's what he would have wanted. So do join us if you can on Friday at 7:30. All right, is everybody checked in? Who can check in? Because I know we have still some issues with the Quickly app. You still working on it? Okay. Before we jump into the conversation for this week, do you guys have any questions about what we went over? It seems like it's been a month since we've been together. Does it feel like that for anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah, it's only been a week. I know, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
So this isn't about like material or anything. I was just gonna say, are we getting a, I guess, study guide for our midterm, or is it gonna be this?
That's a great question. I gave the study guide in quarter 1 because of the volume of material. There's less than half the material in this course as compared to first quarter. So there's no real reason for the study guide.
Okay.
Practically everything that you're going to need is in McInerney's little book. I do encourage you guys to read it. If you do, it'll really help you. This week and going into, well, finishing up last week and going into this week's material, we're going to be looking at the introduction to Stevenson's text, which we touched on last quarter. But the short answer is, I don't do a study guide for this class for that reason. There's just not enough material there to really necessitate it. But that's a great question. Yes?
I do have a question about, the principle of the excluded middle.
Yes.
And then after it says gray areas, I would consider gray areas as middle way. So isn't that a contradiction?
No. But that's a great question. So the question was, the principle of the excluded middle, defined as it is, seems to contradict the very idea of gray areas. If there is some gray between black and white, doesn't that refute, at least, if not completely contradict, the law of the excluded middle? And then the short answer is no, but we need to unpack that a little bit and figure out, like, why is it the case? Why is there no contradiction there? So let's start with that, and then we'll kind of push forward from there. Sound good? That's an excellent question, by the way. We good in the back? All right, perfect.
I hear that.
Once my computer figures out what's going on, maybe it's too early for it to, principle of the excluded middle. The definition is stated between being and non-being. That's the key to the entire question that you asked. And it is such a wonderful question. I mean that. Between being and non-being, there is no middle. Either something exists or it does not exist. There is no middle way in that regard. But what are we talking about in this case? We're talking about the existence of a thing. It's being. Explanation. Something either exists or it does not exist. There is no halfway. There's no in-between. Well, let's look at gray areas. A gray area is a situation in which the truth cannot be clearly established. The law of the excluded middle has to do with existence of an object or a thing. Gray area has to do with situations and the truth of those situations. So you should be able to immediately see a distinction. For me to say that the computer exists is to state a fact, according to McInerney. McInerney lays down two objective facts. Do you guys remember what they are? What are the two kinds of objective facts that McInerney describes? Well, those are the two types of facts, but of the objective category, he lists two. Objects and events. Objects and events. Objects either exist or they don't exist. There's no middle way. Something can't sort of exist ontologically. It's a big word that just talks about the kind of things that are real in the world. Okay. Events, however, even though they are objective facts, can be reported upon in different ways from different perspectives. So the truth of an event is harder to get at. There can be some gray area. Does this make sense? Look at the definition. We must recognize that many things are, in fact, clearly and sharply defined. The computer actually exists. The law of the excluded middle would say there's no in-between here. Either this monitor exists or it doesn't. I have first-hand evidence to suggest that it exists. Therefore, I cannot claim that it does not exist. That seems so obvious that there's no point in even talking about it. And yet, this is the nature of logic, to get down to fundamentals, to facts. Not to see that is simply not to see clearly. Gray can exist as gray only because there are the distinct alternatives of black and white. That this exists concretely, absolutely, creates a kind of situation where events can be reported on in different ways. Because there are objective facts, things like real objects in the world, things that exist, something that is the case, we can potentially arrive at different interpretations of those events. That constitutes a kind of gray. So really the answer to your question is not only does the law of the excluded middle not contradict with gray area, it's because of the law of the excluded middle that gray areas can exist.
But what about like abstract objects or mythical stuff, or like they exist in the mind, but they don't actually exist in the tangible realm?
McInerney strikes me as the kind of logician or philosopher who would not believe in abstract objects at all. Now, there are such things, he claims, as subjective facts, like pain, for instance, is a reality to the person experiencing the pain, but it's not something that I can ascertain directly. I can't measure it directly. I depend upon the good faith testimony of the person experiencing the pain. That's germane to us as chiropractors because that's basically our job every day. If our patients aren't being honest with us, then there's nothing we can do to help them, really. So McInerney meets us at that point of intersection where we have to rely upon the good testimony, the truthful testimony of our patients. But that constitutes a subjective fact. would McInerney think, would he agree to the idea that, or to the claim that ideas, abstract ideas like unicorns or whatever mythical creatures are real subjective facts? Well, he might say, and this is me putting words in his mouth, so it's dangerous in the first place, but he might say something like, imagining certain mythical creatures is an event, and it's real to the person's experiencing it, but in no way does it constitute a reality objectively in the world. There are no such mythical creatures, but it is an event that we can report on, at least from a first-hand account. I have this mental image, this figment of my imagination, or the artist can draw something that doesn't exist, right? And then the drawing becomes a real object, a fact in the world. The experience of imagining a creature is a subjective fact, but the object itself, unicorns or dragons or whatever, aren't real objects according to McInerney. So it doesn't obtain in that sense. You get what I'm saying? There's no gray area there, unless the gray area has to do with how you report upon those objects. Right? How closely can our words match the subjective experience that the artist has in imagining these creatures? Does that make sense? Yes?
If I told you that black and white thinking is a cognitive distortion, what would you say?
I would agree with that, but again, it's context dependent. It's context dependent. And it really has a lot to do with our judgments. So black and white thinking as a cognitive distortion or error generally appeals to or refers to judgments. This thing is good, that thing is bad. Okay? This is where gray area really becomes relevant to us, because in our judgments we have to fall back on the rubric, as it were, whatever standard that we use to make judgments about the world, particularly moral judgments, which is the nature of our third quarter class together. We're going to look at different moral theories as ways of making judgments, ways of arriving at moral reasons that guide our behavior in the world. When we talk about the law of the excluded middle, the rule of the excluded middle, what we're talking about is something ontologically existing or not. Does the screen exist? Does the table exist? Do I exist? Right? Do mythical creatures exist? They either exist or they don't exist. Now, your point about abstract objects is a very good one. This is where I differ from McInerney. I take the view as a philosopher that abstract objects do exist. That's a real point of contention. Some philosophers like me would say, yeah, they do exist. They don't exist in the way that tables and chairs do, but as figments of the imagination, they do exist. Like ideas, like democracy, is an abstract object, and yet it has utility in our lives. It guides our behavior. Okay? So its status as an object is up for debate. People like McInerney would say, well, democracy doesn't exist, but our behavior as an event does exist. Right? This is where we disagree. That's what I know that these are like very similar ideas, and it's kind of hard to parse them out, especially this early in the morning, but I'm hoping that this is helping. You guys okay? Is this all making sense? Go ahead. Need some coffee? They all need coffee. Yeah, I think we should have like something set up in the hallway. You know, like just a coffee station in the hallway for you guys at 7 a.m.
I got you.
It'd be amazing. All right. Okay, week two. To finish up the week two information here, we ended here. We were talking about Aristotle, and we were talking about change and causes of change. Okay? Now this is extremely important. You're going to see this again. How is it that things change but stay the same? This is kind of like the conversation we're just having about gray area and excluded middle. Don't they contradict? McInerney would say, no, it's because things are black and white in their being, that means they either exist or they don't exist, that allow for kind of gray area to emerge. And gray is the way in which we report on events in the world. Does this make sense? Well, in that same thinking, how is it that something can change and stay the same all at the same time? Let me give you an example. Let me get to your question. I have memories of being a child. One of my memories has to do with this scar that's on my knuckle, here, on my ring finger. It's a little scar now, but I remember when I was about 10 years old, I would wash the dishes as one of my chores. And I took that seriously. It seemed like every day I was washing the dishes. Not much has changed. There's no more Sisyphean task in all of modern living than washing the dishes and doing laundry. It just keeps happening, and that boulder keeps rolling down the hill, and we keep pushing it up again, but I digress. I was washing the dishes in a coffee cup, speaking of it. Ceramic coffee cup broke. My hands were soapy, and the cup was slippery, and I dropped it in the sink. And though it fell in the water, it broke, and one of the shards of ceramic cut my hand, and that shard got underneath the skin of my hand. And somehow, that shard ended up back here. It got that far back. So the cut is here, at the very end of the knuckle. But the shard of ceramic ended up under my skin, buried under my skin, about that far. And my cousin, Amanda, who I was just talking about earlier, happened to be there, ran my hand under some hot water, took a pair of tweezers, got under the skin, and pulled that ceramic shard out. I'll never forget it, because I stood there watching the whole thing. Pretty gruesome. Why am I telling you this? Because I believe that I am the same person. And I have evidence to prove it. But it is the case that every 7 years, every cell in my body has completely been replaced. There are no remaining cells of the 10-year-old. And yet the scar remains. I think that I am the same person, and yet there's nothing of that person left. I go by the same name. I have memories of firsthand experiences, and yet that person no longer exists. How is it that something can change completely and yet remain the same? Do what? We are not the body or the mind, is it? Yeah. So then if we are not the body and the mind, then what are we? Is the question. Yeah.
I think maybe it should come in, and I think we just get better. That's not maybe better and better and better.
I think you're right. I do think that we continue to progress and evolve and grow. I think that's true. But getting down to, like, again, the law of the excluded middle, how can something exist and not exist at the same time? If the 10-year-old no longer exists, and yet I'm claiming to be the same person, that seems a contradiction according to the law of the excluded middle. I can't both exist and not exist at the same time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I've heard that 100% of our cells are turned over every 7 years, but I feel like I've also heard that we're born with all the brain cells we'll ever have, and we don't form new ones. Is that?
The turnover of neurons is quite slow. The connections of neurons is constantly changing. So even if it were the case, for instance, that you had all the neurons that you're going to have and they never were replaced, what is the case is that all the neural connections constantly change with learning. So neuroplasticity doesn't ever completely go away, even in profound cases of cognitive impairment and decline. So even with the same neurons, if their connections and orientations keep changing within neural networks, it's not the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
By that logic, is like the same Dr. Thornhill, is that an abstract idea or is that are you concrete? Are you like
Well, there's certainly something concrete here.
right?
I mean, there's blood and bone and carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and all the rest. And then there's this idea of me, of a consistent thing that perdures over time. Now we have to engage with Aristotle. He's going to provide us a way out, so check this out. By the way, this is important to us as doctors. how long are you planning on seeing the same patient? You're gonna have patients that you start as children, and you're gonna adjust them and care for them throughout your entire life. Okay? And you're gonna see them grow and change. Even managing a patient during a short period of time requires watching it change. They come in with some kind of issue, and then you're hoping to see them change over time. What Aristotle's talking about here is all about change. So let's take a look at this. He identifies 4 causes of change. 4 causes of change. Okay? An efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, and final cause. Okay. Let's look at these one at a time. To turn a block of marble into a statue, you have to have these 4 causes. First, you need the marble itself. That's the material cause, quite literally the material out of which something is made. What's the material cause of Dr. Thornhill? Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, magnesium, copper, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. See? Yeah? Yeah. That's the material cause. Then you need something like an efficient cause, the thing that's doing the changing. In the case of the sculpture, it's the sculptor, the artist. He's the efficient cause, or she is the efficient cause, the one literally applying force to the marble, changing its structure. The formal cause is the idea of the sculpture in the artist's mind. I want it to be shaped this way. Let's pause for a second. What's the efficient cause in human change? Like you say, the patient is sick or they're hurt and they're going to change into somebody who's well. What would be the efficient cause?
Awareness?
The innate.
Yeah, we could. I think innate is a great word here to use for that. Some people would say, well, the biochemical processes of human physiology, we could dress it up in all kinds of scientific language, but I think chiropractors really get it right here. Innate intelligence is the efficient cause that brings us from a point of infirmity or injury to a point of health. Okay? That which instrumentally or principally modifies our form, modifies the matter, brings it into a new orientation, healing. Well, what's the formal cause then? The formal cause is the way that the thing ought, I'm using a big, sort of ought here, it ought to be. For instance, if you cut your hand, which is the example that I've been giving, is there a, quote, proper orientation of the skin cells that's most advantageous for the function of my hand? Of course there is, right? The disorganized state of torn, damaged tissue is not going to work very well. There's some better state that the tissue can be in terms of form and function. Does that make sense? So the innate, which is the combined total physiological processes of my body, will change the tissue into a more advantageous state. That's the formal cause, how it ought to be. Does this make sense? Even if the result is a kind of scar. Are you following me so far? The final cause is what the sculpture actually looks like. Do you think that the most advantageous state of my hand is scarred? No, it would have been better had the injury never happened in the first place. Does that make sense? It would have been better if the injury had not happened in the first place, but it did. So the best we got is this scar. It's not perfect, but it's functional. Okay? There are limitations to matter. Who says so? Ralph Stevenson says so. B.J. Palmer says so. Yes?
So, like, could you think of it almost as, like, calluses forming as well? Like, those are advantageous to us because of the, like, increased wear and tear?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great example. So the body is adaptable. There are similarities between the human body and a sculpture. Okay? One of the similarities is no matter how clear the formal cause in the artist's mind, the sculpture will never match it exactly. Does that make sense? There will always be some minor difference between what you imagine and what is. Does that make sense? We can call these limitations of matter. So, to put this in as clear, language as possible, the material cause is literally the elements of your body, the raw stuff, the matter of your body. That's the material cause. The efficient cause in human health and healing, from a chiropractic perspective, is the innate intelligence, which you can think of as the combined physiology of the human body, that which is doing the work. The formal cause would be the, quote, perfect structure and function of every tissue in the body. Okay? But the final cause might be something like a scar. Does that make sense? Okay. Aristotle identifies these four causes as a way of making sense of change. How is it that something can, like a leaf, can be green and then pass through a process of change, turning these beautiful colors of orange and yellow, ultimately to brown and withering and disintegrating, and all the while being considered the same leaf? How can we go from being babies to being full-grown adults and being quote, the same person? What exactly is going on here? What remains consistent throughout? And what is it that actually changes? Okay? Yes?
The efficient cause, well, so as far as the patient goes, what would the provider be?
Well, the provider can also be a kind of efficient cause. So, as a chiropractor, what you're going to be doing is providing an adjusting thrust, which is a kind of kinetic energy that you put into the body, depending on the technique that you use. Some techniques are very forceful, kinematically, and you're putting in a lot of actual energy into the body. Some of them are very low force, but the fact is that you become a kind of efficient cause in manipulating the anatomy, changing the patient's anatomy. But you're not acting alone. The physiology also takes that force and modifies it the best it can to bring about a change in the body. Yeah, so we as chiropractors do become an efficient cause. We have multiple efficient causes here. That's a great question. Okay. The most effective way to avoid vagueness, because that was kind of the topic we were discussing, or ambiguity, in logical discourse is define your terms. We speak in defining terms, but actually what we are defining is the objects to which our terms or our words refer. So in the previous example, when I was talking about material cause, efficient cause, formal cause, final cause, it's one thing for me to use these words and to dress it up in all this, history with Aristotle and whatever. It's quite another thing for me to identify exactly what I mean. If I say a material cause, and I'll leave it at that, it's very vague, it's very ambiguous. But if I say the material cause is literally the matter which my body is composed, the hydrogen, the carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, all those elements, that's the material cause. Then there's no ambiguity. We all know exactly what it means. The blood, the bone, the matter. Okay, that's what we mean about defining our terms. You have to be as specific as possible. Two immediate practical benefits of carefully defining terms. Our own ideas become clarified. Oftentimes we neglect how unclear our own thinking might be about an issue. We think we know what we're talking about until we try to go explain it to someone. You don't know, and this is true, at least this has been true in my experience, you do not know how well you understand the topic until you try to teach it to somebody else. Okay? Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, said if you really want to understand something, teach it to a child. If you can't, then you probably don't understand it very well. Okay? So it helps you to get clear about your own thinking, but as a result, we can more effectively communicate it to others. So get clear about your terms. Define your terms. The categorical statement is extremely important in logic. The purpose of the reasoning process, logic's principal concern, is demonstration. We're trying to demonstrate our thinking, the process of our thinking. I'm not reasoning with you if I simply say that such and such is true and expect you to accept it as true only on my say-so. That means, even as your teacher in this class, if I say something, I better be able to demonstrate why it's true. Do not let me ever get away with saying it's true because I say so. That would be ridiculous. Who am I to say that something is true simply on my own authority? But that's also the case, and we'll look at this with informal fallacies, with anyone. If I were to say, well, it's true because BJ said it, or D.D. Palmer said it. No, it's not. The person saying it does not make it true or false. It has to be demonstrated as true. Does that make sense? I must show you that such and such is true, and I do that by making an argument. An argument will only be as good as the statements of which it is composed, and those statements in turn will only be as good as the terms of which they are composed. Okay, so how do we demonstrate something is true? We make an argument. Fair enough? What makes an argument good? It's statements. What makes a statement good? The words that compose the statement. So now, how important is it that we use good words, correct words? Extremely important. The words make the statements make the argument, and the argument underscores truth, right? It founds true statements. Okay, well, what's true about chiropractic? What's the message that you're going to give to your patients? What about your marketing? What are you going to tell the public about what you do and how you do it? Is it going to be true? Hope so. Otherwise, you're committing fraud. You have to have good words, clear words, clear statements, good arguments. That's what demonstrates truth. Now, the general statement is one whose subject is very large in scope. Such a statement is not necessarily inaccurate, but it could be vague. Quote, some of the principles are basic, upon which others are founded or derived, as going from the general to the specific. Some are down to a part of the whole thing. These specific principles are, of course, derived principles. They are not limited to any given number. A fundamental principle of chiropractic is a statement of the quality or actions of intelligence in matter, which will include any and all circumstances that may arise in study. This is from Stevenson's book. This was one of the required readings for this discussion. What Stevenson is doing is he's setting us up. He's saying, I'm about to give you an argument. Think back to what we just said. Arguments are based upon statements. Statements based upon words, yeah? I'm about to give you an argument proving the truth of chiropractic. Do you think that's a big deal?
Yes.
It's huge. Ralph Stevenson taught philosophy at Palmer College while BJ was the president. I can't imagine more pressure as a faculty member. Okay? If that were me, every day I'd come to work and be like, BJ, why don't you do it? You just teach them. But it was Stevenson's job to teach philosophy at Palmer under BJ Palmer. What he did was take all of the combined works that BJ put together at that time and condense them down into a kind of syllogism, a deductive argument, proving the truth of chiropractic. That became the foundation of traditional chiropractic philosophy for generations. To this day, a great number of chiropractors live and practice by these principles. In fact, if you hear a chiropractor say that they are, quote, principled, these are the principles they're talking about. Okay? Delta Sigma Chi fraternity. They have to memorize these principles. That's how much it means to them. Okay? We're going to look at this argument, and then we're going to look at what contemporary philosophers in chiropractic, like Dr. David Cope, what they've done with the argument since it was first published in 1927. Why are we doing this? Again, for generations, this argument, these principles have been the foundation of traditional chiropractic philosophy. Nothing could be more germane to your studies in this course than this argument. Does that make sense? But we cannot just let it sit where it is in 1927. We have to critically evaluate it. That's why we have a class in logic. Does the argument actually work? Are the words clear? Are the statements clear? Is the argument true? Or does it fail? That's what we're going to look at as we go on from here. Okay? All generalizations are dangerous, even this one, says Alexander Dumas. This is where Ralph Stevenson begins his syllogism, where he begins his argument. Principle number one is what he calls the major premise. In any deductive syllogism, deductive argument, we begin with a major premise, statement. This is what's interesting about it. If the major premise is false, everything that follows it is false. So this has to be true. It has to be true. Okay? We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at these, but I'm going to go through the argument rather quickly. Okay? Let's look at this major premise. A universal intelligence is in all matter, continually giving to it all of its properties and actions, thus maintaining it in existence. Are you willing to subscribe to that? Are you willing to endorse that statement as true? And it's okay to say no. It's pretty loaded, right? What did we just say about generalizations? What did we just say about vague or ambiguous language? There's a lot of questions that need to be clarified from here. What do you mean by a universal intelligence, Stevenson? Well, it comes from BJ's writings, but we can't take his authority as our foundation of truth. Who is BJ? He can't just, by edict, say something is true and make it true. He's not a god. Either a universal intelligence exists or it doesn't. This is why we have to read Stevenson's introduction to get a sense of what he means by universal intelligence. My question to you, however, is, can we go there with him? Can we make this assumption for the time being so that we can evaluate the rest of the argument? Are you willing to go there with him? When you watch a movie, you have to suspend your disbelief. Have you ever heard this terminology? What does it mean to suspend your disbelief? Be ready to believe what you see, at least for the short term. For the short term, like let's say I'm watching something ridiculous, like a Godzilla movie. Okay? They've made lots and lots of these. I find them hilarious. All right? But let's say I'm watching something like a Godzilla movie. It's like, does Godzilla exist? No. Okay? But for the moment, I'm going to suspend my disbelief, and I'm going to go there with the director. I'm going to watch this and kind of believe it, right? For the sake of entertainment. Can we suspend our disbelief for the moment and go here with Stevenson? That a universal intelligence exists, that it is in all matter and continually gives to this matter its properties and actions and maintains it in existence. If we can, then we are open to the rest of the argument. If not, we need to shut it down right now. But to do that, either way, we would have to have reasons. Does this make sense?
So are you saying that whenever we're presented with any type of like argument or evidence that we have to ask ourselves, like, am I going to suspend my disbelief and lean into this, or am I going to shut this down? Either way, we need to have reasoning for either or.
Absolutely. It's precisely what I'm saying.
One of my affirmations is I am more alone and less of you.
That's a great affirmation. That's a great affirmation. If somebody makes a claim, let's say the claim is chiropractors are quacks. Ouch. I don't have to be offended in the first place. This is just somebody's criticism, right? Does that constitute a premise? It can if they, build off of that and make it into an argument. Or it could represent a conclusion. Therefore, chiropractors are quack. Okay, well then they'd have to have some kind of argument that built up in that statement. Does that make sense? In either case, I would have to ask myself, am I willing to, for the moment, suspend any judgment and follow the argument to its conclusion? Or am I going to shut it down from the start? And if I do, I have to have some argument of my own as to why it needs to be shut down. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Doesn't this all just become subjective because it depends on what this the text at hand?
It would be possible to say that unless we follow McInerney's thinking. For instance, for McInerney, as we've discussed, words pertain to real objects or events in the world. There is something that is actually the case. There is a real objective truth that we can ascertain. Does this make sense?
That makes sense, yeah.
Right. So if there's something that is actually the case, and our words match to what is actually the case, then we can speak truth so long as we're careful in selecting our words. We can communicate something true, and we can really know things. This is the value of the kind of realism that McInerney has adopted, that things actually exist, that we perceive them as they actually are, and that our words can be matched to those real objective truths
But isn't that
or facts.
in itself, if someone was like, oh, chiropractor is quack, well, there's one person that's gonna know what quack is, and the staff next to it, and the other person is like, well, I'm a chiropractor graduate, so no, they're not.
Sure.
It's like, I'm
Right, and this is exactly why at the very beginning of such an argument, I would have to ask myself, am I willing to suspend any judgment about this and follow it to its conclusion? Am I willing to even entertain this kind of reasoning, right? Because there would have to be some objective fact that is a quote quack. That would have to exist in the first place for the argument to make any sense at all. If there is no such thing as a quack, quote unquote, and there's no reason for me to even entertain this argument. Does that make sense? So we have to get really clear about our terminology in the very beginning. Does that make sense? Yeah. I keep slowing it down because this is the kind of reasoning that I bring to these kinds of arguments. If someone wants to criticize chiropractic by making such a claim, my first reaction is, okay, give me an argument. Don't just cast aspersions at my profession, this thing for which I've committed my life and my livelihood. Say what you want. That's your choice. That's your freedom. But make an argument. Well, that's what I thought. And then let's say that someone can make an argument. They say, let's define quack as X. Chiropractors meet the description of X, therefore chiropractors are X. That's an argument. Okay? If I'm willing to suspend judgment and follow that line of reasoning, then we can look at the definition of those terms. And only then can I build a kind of counter argument. Does that make sense? But this is the kind of good faith argument that is so rare in the world these days. But that kind of intellectual discourse requires sound reasoning, which is exactly what this class is about. Either such a thing as a quack exists ontologically as an objective fact, or it doesn't. And if it does, and only then is it possible for chiropractors to meet that description. Then if that's the case, you'd have a sound argument. If not, you don't. Does that make sense? This is why we study logic. Most of the time, what you guys are going to experience are people that just cast judgments, dispersions, criticisms, and they're completely empty. Because people can't make arguments. They don't even know how. They wouldn't know an argument if it hit them in the face. That sounds pretty harsh, but it's true. Okay? This is where Stevenson begins his argument. A universal intelligence is in all matter, continually giving to it all of its properties and actions, thus maintaining it in existence. That's his premise. It's an assumption that we make about the world. Okay? If that's true, it follows the expression of this intelligence through matter is the chiropractic meaning of life. Okay? Now, meaning of life in this case is not what you typically think of in a philosophy course, where meaning is tied to purpose. What is the purpose of my life? That's not what Stevenson means by meaning. What he's talking about is what makes life different from non-life. Things that are living versus things that are inanimate, like tables and chairs. Okay? Intelligence, manifesting itself through matter, is what life ultimately is in its essence. Okay? As opposed to inanimate objects like tables and chairs. The union of intelligence and matter. Life is necessarily the union of intelligence and matter. That follows from principle number 2. If you're gonna have something that's, quote, alive, it has to be both the raw stuff of which it's made, but it also has to be intelligent. What do we mean by intelligence? Given to it by this universal intelligence, which is the foundation of the whole argument. Life is a triunity having three necessary uniting factors: intelligence, force, and matter. Matter we understand. It's the calcium, it's the phosphorus, it's the carbon, it's the hydrogen, etc. Force is something that we understand from physics. Physicists really only acknowledge four forces: strong and weak nuclear forces, gravitational forces, and electromagnetic force. What about this intelligence? Well, again, that's baked into the major premise. If there is such a thing as a universal intelligence, that universal intelligence can express itself through raw matter. And that's what's going to give meaning, definition, to life versus non-life. Which means you have to have three united factors: matter, force, and intelligence. That's all he's saying so far. Okay? Are you guys with me? We call that the triune. The perfection of the triune. In order to have 100% life, therefore, there must be 100% matter, 100% force, and 100% matter. This is a kind of miniature argument within the bigger argument. Okay? He's already led you to a conclusion. He's saying that if you want something to be alive, you have to have the complete fulfillment of these three factors in their totality. Principle number 6, there is no process that does not require time. So this bringing together of force, matter, and intelligence happens in time. He's adding this premise not just for completeness, but because this is how things seem to exist for us in reality. Things happen in time. The amount of intelligence for any given amount of matter is 100%, and it's always proportional to its requirements. What he's trying to say here is that if you want to get something that's organized, no matter what it is, like Dr. Thornhill, you're going to have a certain amount of percentage, let's say, of intelligence to give rise to that organization. Why is it that after my hand got cut, it healed back in a similar form? Even if it was slightly altered, a similar form to what it was before. Because it does so intelligently. It follows a particular pattern of organization. This is what Stevenson means. So to get that form, you have to have 100% of the intelligence. You can think of it as information or a blueprint. The function of intelligence is to create force. Okay? The amount of force created by intelligence is always 100%. So intelligence is creating force. Force is always 100%. Then what's the purpose of force? It's to unite intelligence with matter. Remember, those are the three things that have to come together to make something alive: intelligence, force, and matter. Intelligence is making the force. Force is the connecting link between intelligence and matter. So he's describing a kind of relationship. The forces of universal intelligence are manifested by physical laws. They are unswerving and unadapted and have no solicitude for the structures in which they work. What this means is that those four forces of physics that I mentioned earlier, the strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, and gravity, they do not care about you or me or anything. They act on everything the same way. Does this make sense? You're not going to get preferential treatment by the force of gravity simply by being a really good person. It's going to act on everybody the same. Interference with the transmission of universal forces. There can be interference with the transmission of those forces. Can electromagnetic force be interfered with? Yes. Yes. Can strong and weak nuclear forces potentially be interfered with? Yes. This is all he's saying. They act indiscriminately on everything, but they can be interfered with. Now, as an argument, this is important. If interference can happen on such a fundamental level, then interference can happen in a more specific form in the human body down the road. Does this make sense? You can already see the foreshadowing that's happening here in the argument. There's a very specific kind of interference that we care about as chiropractors called subluxation. What he's done here at this early point in the argument, we're getting close to about halfway. Okay, there are 33 of these, so hang tight. Okay. What he's done is he has placed interference as a fundamental reality at the level of physical laws. Could not be more foundational. And if interference is happening there, interference is happening at every level of scale. Does this make sense? Including at the spine, including in the nervous system. So this is the way that he is setting the argument up to justify subluxation down the road. The function of matter is to express force. Let's do a brief recap. Intelligence creates force. Force links intelligence with matter. Matter expresses force. You guys have to understand this. Okay? Force is manifested by motion in matter. All matter has motion, therefore there is universal life in all matter. What this means is, at the very ground level of all material objects, there is motion. You may not have ever heard this term, but there is a thing called Brownian motion that Einstein discovered. He confirmed it. The idea of it preceded him, but he confirmed it experimentally. Anything around you that seems static, still, is actually in motion. Pretty wild. But if you had a sharp enough microscope, you could observe the table, your laptop, the water bottle. Everything is in motion. The atoms of everything are constantly moving. Brownian motion. Where does motion come from? It comes from the application of force. Think about what Newton said. An object at rest will remain at rest. An object in motion will remain in motion. Acted on by an outside what? Force. Force is what creates motion. Everything is in motion. Are you with me so far? What is the purpose of force? To link intelligence with matter. What is the purpose of matter? To express the forces that are constantly acting upon it. Everything is in motion. Everything is expressing intelligence through force. Does this make sense? Matter can have no motion without the application of force by intelligence. What does intelligence do? It creates force. When we get to principle 16, we reach a turning point where we stop talking about universal things and start talking about living things. And it also marks the halfway point of the argument. Universal intelligence gives force to both organic and inorganic matter. Now that's not just carbon chemistry, that's life and not life. Okay? Every effect has a cause, and every cause has effects. That means things happen in a sequence-specific fashion. Number 18, the signs of life. Remember, we're talking about living versus not living. The signs of life are evidence of the intelligence of life. Intelligence creates force. Force moves matter. Intelligence is expressed through the force acting on matter. So whatever living things are, they are a manifestation, a representation of intelligence. The material of the body of a living thing is organized matter. But so is your table, so is your water bottle, so is your bag. All of that is organized matter. So what's the difference then between inanimate objects and life? Well, Stevenson would claim the signs of life. A living thing has an inborn intelligence within its body called its innate intelligence. The mission of innate is to maintain the material of the body of a living thing in active organization. Active organization implies a kind of responsiveness of things to the world around it. It's not passive. The table, the chair, the water bottle are all passive. Okay? Depending on what acts upon it, they're either going to maintain that organization or they're going to fall apart. And eventually entropy will act on everything and it will break down. But we are existing in active organization. We are responding, we are adapting, we are evolving as living things. That's a result of our own innate intelligence within us. There's 100% of innate intelligence in every living thing, the requisite amount proportional to its organization. So, would you think that a tapeworm is less complex than a human being? Which do you think is more complex as a structure, as an organized structure? A human being composed of some 70 trillion cells, or a flatworm? This is an obvious question. It's the human being, far more complex, right? So whatever intelligence manifests through force has to be requisite to the amount of organization of the object, okay? So for the innate intelligence of the human being, it's going to be more complex, more organized, proportionate to its complexity as a structure. The function of innate is to adapt universal forces and matter for use in the body so that all parts of the body will have coordinated action for mutual benefit. What are the forces of physics? We've already talked about those 4 forces. What is our innate intelligence doing? It's adapting itself to those forces so that we can maintain our organization, so that we can stay alive. We don't break down. But there are limits. Innate intelligence adapts forces and matter for the body as long as it can, without breaking a universal law. Or innate intelligence is limited by the limitations of matter. Think about my example earlier. I cut my hand. I was able to adapt to that injury, but there were limitations to how much I could adapt. Right? The result was a scar. My hand still works. The bleeding is stopped. But there are limitations to what the body can do. This is what Stevenson is trying to convey at this point in the argument. We're almost to the end. Hang tight. The forces of innate never injure or destroy the structure in which they work. The intelligence of our bodies always works to maintain the body. It always works to heal and to adapt and coordinate our bodies to the stress that impinges upon it. Number 26. In order to carry on the universal cycle of life, universal forces are destructive. Innate forces are constructive as regards our structure. Let me ask you guys this. We just talked about this yesterday in Mr. 5 minutes. The 3 primary skin cancers that you guys are going to learn, basal cell, squamous cell, and melanoma, are all caused by ultraviolet radiation from the sun. That's a universal force, ultraviolet. Are you with me so far? Okay? But that same ultraviolet radiation is important to our physiology because it's how we convert vitamin D. Vitamin D is essential to keep us alive. So you're telling me that the same ultraviolet radiation that is essential for our survival could also kill us? Yes. Well, what makes the difference? The ability of our body to adapt to that universal force. That's what Stevenson is saying here. Universal forces like ultraviolet are always destructive. Always. Okay, well then, how could they ever be constructive? Well, because our own innate intelligence adapts them in such a way that is beneficial to us. That's the intelligence of the body. Innate intelligence is always normal, and its function is always normal, which means when you heal in such a way as to maintain your unique kind of organization. You're always healing back into yourself. You're not changing constantly into some other species. What comes to mind here is The Fly. You guys ever see the 1980s version of The Fly with Jeff Goldblum? Amazing movie. You guys seen this? Really gross, but also an incredible use of special effects. Let me give you the premise for those of you who haven't seen it. Jeff Goldblum is a scientist, and he's developed technology that allows for teleportation. You get into one pod, you press the button, you dematerialize, and then rematerialize in a pod on the other side of the room. Incredible technology. Imagine how much time this would save. You guys want to get to class in a hurry? Well, you have a pod in your apartment or your house. There's another pod here at Life University. You get into one, you press the button, you dematerialize, boom, you rematerialize here. Incredible. This is the premise. Except, he gets into one pod, he's going to test this on himself because he's a responsible scientist. He doesn't test it on harmless animals. So he gets into his own pod, he presses the button, he dematerializes. What he doesn't realize is when he does it, a common housefly gets into the pod with him. They both dematerialize, but only he materializes in pod B. What happened to the fly? The fly got integrated into his own DNA. So over the course of the remainder of the movie, he slowly turns into a human-fly hybrid. It's super gross and really amazing. And it's aged pretty well. I mean, if you go back and watch it now, it's still really impressive. Why am I telling you this? Because innate intelligence, as you continue to turn over those cells, remember that your cells turn over every 7 years, you're going to continue to be a human being. Not just a human being, but you as a unique human being. You're not going to be, your innate intelligence is not going to turn you into a human-fly hybrid. That's what he's trying to say here.
I have a discussion with the first, the last one, Saturday.
Yes.
And it never hindered or never destroys. When you're born to die, so as you go through the process, living, there's still destruction.
There is, yeah, and this is a good question. So the question was, if the innate intelligence that we all have is always normal and always constructive, how is it the case then that we all end up dying? No one is immortal. Not only that, but one of the real objections to innate intelligence, as you guys have read. Remember, like you guys have read Dr. Morgan's article. Yeah? One of the arguments against innate intelligence might be something like autoimmune diseases. Because then at that point it seems like your own body is attacking itself. So how can Stevenson claim this to be true in the face of something like an autoimmune disease? Or the finality of life? One of the explanations, as we'll see toward the end of the argument here, has to do with miscommunication. Many autoimmune diseases seem to be the body's immune system miscommunicating with the rest of the body, the rest of the system. So it's not necessarily that the innate intelligence of the body is flawed. There seems to be a kind of miscommunication or noise in the system of the body. It's one way of maybe making the argument. The other one is limitations of matter. Remember, even I, when I cut my hand, it didn't heal perfectly. It healed as a scar. Well, that isn't keeping with the way of the world as it is. There are limitations of matter. The sculpture will never be a perfect representation of the formal cause, of the idea in the mind of the sculptor. Does that make sense? The forces of innate intelligence operate through and over the nervous system in animal bodies. Okay? That's how we get organization. That's how intelligence manifests through the work of the nervous system. Number 29. There can be interference with the transmission of innate forces. Like I said earlier with this foreshadowing, if there can be interference with universal forces, there certainly can be interference with innate forces. Number 30. Interference with the transmission of innate forces causes incoordination or dis-ease. Remember from first quarter, dis-ease literally means a disharmony, incoordination. Here's the end. Interference with transmission in the body is always directly or indirectly due to subluxation of the spinal column. So what is this interference to innate? Subluxation at the level of the spine. Coordination is the principle of harmonious action of all the parts of an organism in fulfilling their offices and purpose. He's describing what health looks like. When there is no interference, when everything is communicating appropriately, remember what I said about autoimmune disease and miscommunication? When you have good communication, you have health, you have ease. The end of the argument here is the law of demand and supply, which is existent in the body in its ideal state, wherein the clearinghouse is the brain, innate the virtuous banker, brain cells are clerks, and nerve cells are messengers. So he ends the argument here with a kind of metaphor pertaining to the banking system in the 1920s. Now that's a bit ironic, considering by 1929, 2 years after this was published, we have the Great Depression. But that's a whole other argument. Okay? Do you see what he's arguing here? Do you understand the structure of this whole argument? What he's saying is, organization, order in the universe is not random. That really is the assumption behind the major premise. In the world that we live in, the universe that we live in, we have order, we have complexity, we have organization, and it's not random. It points to a kind of universal intelligence. Okay? That universal intelligence is manifest in each one of us as a kind of innate intelligence that keeps us organized, that keeps us coordinating and adapting. And in its ideal state, it operates perfectly. But there can be interference. When that interference happens, it leads to dis-ease. So then what is health? Health is a state of organization in the body. It's the pure and perfect manifestation of intelligence. Do you think we ever attain to that? No. There's always going to be a little bit of noise, always a little bit of interference. What's the purpose of the chiropractor then? To try to reduce subluxation and reduce noise as much as possible. That's what this argument is all about. Again, this was published in 1927. What we have to do from the standpoint of logic and reasoning is to evaluate this argument. Ask ourselves questions like, does it work? What are its flaws? If it does work, what does it have to teach us now in the 21st century? We'll get into that a little bit after our break. Take about 10 minutes, and we'll get started again at 8:25.
That guy, he couldn't develop it. He couldn't develop it. So what he did is take the ball, throw it in the middle. So it's simple. And then those teams are pushing each other. See these people try to throw it. And then try to get that ball from the middle and bring it up to the side. So getting high pushing is kind of
I mean, she's always just.
I mean, you said you're done with it, right?
She has some. She's doing something.
yeah.
I think they're.
Yeah, I just
not
felt
like
like
a
injection.
but they're all in Cincinnati. It's
I might borrow it for a second actually, since I haven't read it, unless I'm reading it, like, read it or talk about it. But now I appreciate it. Do you think I would finish it?
No, I would rather you, I do not. If you need to do it, and then we can do it.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Couple other people are waiting too.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Everybody's just on it? It must be a great one, honestly. Oh, just as you know, actually, I had a great third, like, I like it too. But my stuff's not like, I'll do like single-legged. Nothing shade, and then just like that, just fast. You look tall.
Be able to recognize your distance.
Really looks a bit thick. I went to Saturday. So what, how do you get I went a couple times. I'm not going to the 60. Yeah.
Once again, I know it's a lot less content.
Those gyms are expensive. So. Yeah. I'm coming with you.
I don't know if it's your brain. It's live.
No.
really? Wow. How is it? Is it good? Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. Maybe in the settings, but so I do know if you turn it, you can see a lot to go.
Oh, yeah, that's all. There is a toolbar customization.
Oh, there is? I need the step-by-step guide.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess I was kind of inevitable. I'm going to figure out these issues. But that auto text writer thing is very, very, very useful.
Oh, does it just like hear it?
No, I write and then it translates it into text.
Oh, that's
It's not only does it force me to actually write like a human being instead of myself, but it's good for like inserting notes.
Yeah, so.
Well, thank God you looked. I know, I emailed them and I was like, I'm going to talk to you before class as well. So, just look out. I bet that happened a lot. I'm gonna talk to him like, can we like change that to where it opens like right after class? Because that makes the most sense. It does. Don't wait. Did you get that email?
That I do.
I definitely stressed over students, and now I feel like I've got a group, but then I missed one of the quizzes, and I was like,
Great. Literally, I did one
taking up too much space. I thought about like taking it week 1, week 2. Yeah. We have 2 rooms anyway. We share a kitchen.
graduated from here.
Oh yeah. Like here on campus or off campus?
Graduated.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah. I don't know. I'm planning on moving out probably after the October quarter. And probably my boyfriend's planning to move down around Thanksgiving. I'm moving out kind of looking, but like I'm not ready.
He's gonna come. He's gonna move.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's nice. I love boyfriends that follow their girlfriends.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he was a big encourager. He was like, I'm not gonna let you smash your dreams. Like, go. You have to go.
That's so good. That's so good.
We hit the gym during. Yeah, we're getting.
You're gonna probably move with him.
Yeah, so we're moving with him, and then we may live with other people, but we're gonna get our house done. We're talking about getting engaged here soon, and then
You're getting engaged!
got the ring and everything. Just wants to do it. So now I'm like, oh my god, when's it gonna happen? It's definitely out. I'm excited. Thank you. They talk about just going to Vegas. And then doing like a wedding, like, and I've never been out west. Like, we go get married in Vegas and then we just have our honeymoon out. This is like, that'd be fun. Do it like an elopement.
We went to Vegas
One time.
I had the Vegas experience for sure.
I will say, that was
My
kind
first clubs where I can pay for men to dance with me.
I know, I want to go and I just have so much fun. Like, that's I've never done anything like that.
I did it just like, I don't remember it was before or after my graduation, but it was before that. And like, it was so funny because it started in LA. So I had like the LA experience as well, but then I ended up with like the models and wannabe models and actors scene. So Beverly Hills and like hip hop and like you know what else and like had a blast. Because of them, because of the people that I met there, I ended up connected really nice with guys and like promoters, clubs and all that stuff. But after that, I went to
You gotta earn the rest today. So maybe like right after class, you just
Oregon
to
and
the club there.
like
It's pulling out of fucking shit.
festival so I went from like whole party
What time?
to like more stuff. And after that I committed. I said like no more alcohol.
We've been talking about arguments. Why are arguments important to us? I mean, it's early, you guys, I understand. Why are arguments important to us? Yes? Yeah, it gets us closer to the truth. That's essential. We can't even navigate the world unless we have some idea of what's true. Not only that, but you stake your life on what you think is true. You think chiropractic truly helps patients, people, live healthier, happier, more fulfilling lives. If that's the case, you should be able to reason to that conclusion. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You have to be able to form an argument. Otherwise, what's left to you is to make a statement based on your own authority. Chiropractic works because I say so. That's childish. It works because you can apply reason and logic and craft an argument and show step by step how you go from basic assumptions that we make about the world, principles, and how those lead ultimately to the conclusion that chiropractic is an effective way to help people live happier, healthier, more fulfilling lives. As an example here, Stevenson's long deductive argument was an attempt to do just that. And it's long, it's a bit tedious, but at the very core of it is this triune. Intelligence is connected to matter by force. And why is that important to us? It's important to us because health, as we understand it, is a kind of organized state of the body. Health is organization, a very unique kind of organization, to be sure, and one that could not exist without the application of intelligence through force. This is Stevenson's foundational argument. Okay, well, why is that important? This came up during the break. You guys know about the laws of, you ever heard of the word entropy? Anybody? Studied this in undergrad, entropy? Okay? Yeah. The second law of thermodynamics states that everything in the universe is moving toward greater and greater disorder. This is the law of entropy. And we know this to be a mathematical certainty. That's why it's a law. It's the strongest idea that we have in science. Okay, well, if everything is moving toward greater disorder, greater randomness, greater entropy, how do we get anything organized at all? Furthermore, how do we get something extraordinarily complex and organized like the human body that adapts and heals and seems to actually increase in its order and organization through healing and repair? Stevenson would say the answer is intelligence, acting through force, organizing matter. He's made an argument. His argument may not be completely invulnerable to attack. You can still criticize it. In fact, there are certain weaknesses, there are certain, I don't know if they're fatal flaws, but certainly flaws and maybe anachronisms, old-fashioned language that we have to contend with. In fact, the conclusion itself is framed in this kind of antiquated metaphor of the banking system in the 1920s. We have some issues with Stephen. That's okay. What we're going to do in this talk is look at the language of argumentation, and we're going to analyze Stevenson's argument from a contemporary perspective. We're going to use Dr. David Koch's revision of that argument as our foundation. I've given you guys excerpts from Dr. Koch's book in Blackboard, so please read those. Please try to follow along. This painting is supposed to depict the Roman Senate. We can assume that this figure standing here is someone like Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator, in the time of Julius Caesar. The reason I mention that is because in those days you lived or died, literally, by the strength of your arguments. Will chiropractic philosophy survive? It's determined by the strength of its arguments. Recall the earlier reference to the elemental move of reasoning, the inferential move, whereby we go from one idea that is known to be true to a second idea that is recognized as true on the force of the first idea. This move constitutes the heart of argumentation. So how an argument should work is you begin with a statement, a major premise, that is most certainly true. Now, granted, it's an assumption that we make about the world, but it's one of the strongest assumptions that we can make. What you would hope would be something like a statement of an objective fact. The monitor exists. If that were our major premise, we'd be in pretty good ground here. Because my words are now attached to an objective fact. Or maybe an event. What would that event be? We met for class at 7 a.m. on April 22nd. I had to look at my watch because it's so early I don't even know what day it is. That's an objective fact. It's an event. Okay?
Me neither.
If that were our major premise, then we could say, because that's true, inferentially, we can also say that certain other things are true. If it's the case that we met for class at 7 a.m. on April 22nd, then it follows that there were people in RCC1 at 7 a.m. on April 22nd. Is it safe for us to say that based on our first statement? Absolutely. That's an inferential move. We can infer that there must have been people in RCC1 if, in fact, CPAP 8102 met that day. Does that make sense? Now, is that always the case? No. Could we have met somewhere else for class? Sure, but we're making an inferential move. This is how argumentation works. Yeah?
What's the difference between an inference and an assumption?
Inference is a kind of assumption that we make based on the stated facts. So they're kind of one and the same. It just represents a unique category of assumptions. If this is the case, then we can assume safely that the following is also true. But the strength of an argument stands or falls based on those assumptions, those inferential moves. It's a great question. What are the questions you guys have? All right. Arguments, as we saw, are composed of statements. And it is the statements within an argument that convey the ideas with which the inferential move is concerned. Statements are very important. Statements are composed of words. Arguments can get complicated, chiefly by reason of the number of statements that they contain. But every argument, no matter how complicated, is extremely simple in its essential character. Even Stevenson's argument, with its 33 sequential steps, it's pretty simple in its structure when you get down to it. And it's composed of statements. Every argument is composed of two basic elements, two different types of statements. A premise statement and a conclusion statement. What are the premises of Stevenson's argument? Well, there are essentially 32 of them, leading to the conclusion statement. Well, what is the conclusion of Stevenson's argument if you were to try to paraphrase it? What's Stevenson getting at with his argument? It's really the big idea. Another way that we could phrase it would be, health is the result of intelligence acting through force, organizing matter. That's the conclusion of the whole argument. And I truly wish it had been stated that clearly, rather than being dressed up in the metaphor of banking. This is why we have to take a fresh look at Stevenson's argument. If someone were to ask me, Dr. Thornhill, describe chiropractic philosophy in the fewest words possible, I would say, organization implies intelligence. That's just a restating of the triune. Intelligence is connected to matter by force. But I'm using the word organization specifically because health is a kind of organization. And organization implies intelligence. Okay? A premise is a supporting statement. It's the starting point of an argument, containing the known truth from which the inferential move begins. A conclusion is a supported statement, a statement that is accepted as true on the basis of the premise, or premises. Complicated arguments usually result from the large number of premises that they contain. Stevenson's is a great example. As mentioned, from how those premises relate to one another. You can have a set of premises in which one builds on another so that they have to be arranged in the proper sequence. Stevenson's is a complicated argument, to be sure. Anything that's that long, any argument that requires 33 steps, is complicated. Logical indicators for premises are because, since, on account of. I might ask you, what are some examples of logical indicators? Indicators for premises. Because, since, on account of. Common logical indicators for a conclusion are the words therefore, thus, and so. How do you know in an argument whether what you're reading is a premise or the conclusion? Well, if the words because and so are being used, it's probably a premise. If the author has used the words therefore and thus, it's probably the conclusion. Okay? Absolutely. To get them out of sequence would be to commit the fallacy on the syntax error, essentially. You're getting the words and the argument out of order. It's not going to make sense anymore. It would be like the effect preceding the cause.
What are you doing? Same. I'm just figuring out how to use the new device.
You put them
Well,
both.
I have not seen it.
I'm recording with this, so that way I can hear his words later on. And then I have to let my notebook at home, so I'm trying it with this.
Yeah, I love this.
Well, that's
And
the case.
basically,
It works great with fiction, but even then, by the time you get to the end of the story, you should be able to construct for yourself a series of cause and effect events that lead to that conclusion.
I can
So
extend
an
the
argument can
computer
even be
into
derived from something as trivia, the Matrix, or Memento, or there have been plenty of sci-fi movies that play with backwards causation. But ultimately, when we're talking about deductive arguments, the premise precedes the conclusion. If it's going to make sense. More elaborate expressions can be used to announce premises, like in view of the fact that. And conclusions can be framed as it necessarily follows that. Blah, 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 whatever it is. Okay? So look for these indicators in examining arguments. How do you know you're dealing with a premise or a conclusion? The nature of a universal statement is such that if it is true, a particular statement with the same subject and predicate is also true. This is for universal statements. The logic behind the move from universal to particular and the necessity it entails is simple enough. If I know something to be true about an entire group, then it must also be true about any portion of the group. That is, if I've correctly identified a universal statement. Okay, well, here's an example. All men are mortal. Is that true? I mean, I'm asking you honestly. Is the statement, all men are mortal, true?
yes.
Yeah, that's the definition of man. Man is mortal. To be anything other than mortal would be something other than man. Does this make sense?
It would be nice to use human.
All men are mortal. Socrates
Man.
is a man. He's a particular individual within the category of mortal men.
Woman.
Does that make sense? Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is exactly
Yeah, he just
what
said
is being referred to
human.
here. There's a universal statement
Yes,
about
where
men,
the woman
that is,
and men.
they are mortal. Socrates is an individual example within that category, which means what's true of the category of men must also
My
be true of
feminist
Socrates.
is showing.
Therefore, Socrates is
No,
mortal.
I'm not a feminist.
A universal intelligence is in all matter, continually giving to it all of its properties and actions, thus maintaining it in existence. That's a universal statement. If it's the case that universal intelligence is in all matter, then I, as a representation of matter, must also have universal intelligence manifested in me. This is the beginning of how we have to evaluate Stevenson's argument. Does that universal statement about universal intelligence hold true? And if it does, what are the implications? How does it change the way we read the argument? The move from universal to particular ensures a necessarily true conclusion. The movement from particular to universal offers no such assurance. Knowledge of a part does not allow me to say anything definitive about the whole. It's not enough, I love this quote, it's not enough for a premise to be true, to make it a sound foundation for an argument. It must also be sufficiently large in scope to encompass the conclusion. And that's precisely what cannot happen if the premise is a particular statement and the conclusion a universal statement. Conclusions have to be very specific. The whole can contain a part, but got the sequence of things out of order. The conclusion should be very specific. Human beings have a spine. Within the spine is the central cord of the nervous system that communicates messages and allows order and organization. Intelligence, innate intelligence, moving through the nervous system through force, bringing about organization and order. This is specific to humans with a vertebrae with a nervous system. Does this make sense? Now, if you get that out of order, and you began the argument with something that specific, there's nowhere to go from there. If you went from the specific to the universal, well, by the time you get to the universal, you're dealing with things that may or may not have a nervous system, may or may not have spines. It gets weird. There are plenty of species of living things on this planet that don't have vertebrae. Okay? If we said something, if we began our argument with something specific about
Like
vertebrates,
oysters.
by the time we get to the universal, it wouldn't make sense. That's what this is trying to say. Let's talk about predication. That about which something is said is the subject. What is said is the predicate. That about which something is said is the subject. What is actually said is the predicate. Predication, then, is the idea, connecting process by which we attribute something to something else. If predication is the process of bringing ideas together and coupling them, and the test of sound predication is that the ideas that are brought together belong together. Pretty straightforward. Ideas belong together if their grammatical connection reflects a real connection in the objective order of things. Think about what McInerney is assuming here. He's saying that the way that the world appears to us is the way the world actually is. That's a pretty big assumption. But that being the case, if I were to say something about the way that this podium is put together, whatever I said would have to actually match with the relationship of the parts of the podium to each other. Does that make sense? That's just me describing it accurately. That's what predication is all about. What's the subject? The podium. What's the argument? Well, the argument is representing through my words the real relationships that all of the parts of this podium have with each other. And as long as my words accurately reflect those relationships, then I have a good argument. You see how easily, though, it would be for me to get this wrong? For my words to misrepresent the relationship of the parts? How much more true could it be about the human being and its complexity? Or our messy lives and all the relationships that we have with each other? It's kind of like when you look on social media and someone's relationship status is just complicated. Okay, yeah, that means if you're going to describe it accurately, you better have a kind of complicated argument. Because that's the truth of the nature of the relationship. This is what predication is about. Well, what's the argument about? It's about the person and their relationship with other people. How complex is the argument? As complex as reality itself. And no more complicated than that. We hope. Let's talk about negative and affirmative statements. Affirmative statements connect ideas. Negative statements disconnect ideas. A universal negative statement completely disconnects ideas. No philosophers are infallible is a universal negative statement. What that means is there is no philosopher under any circumstance at any time or place that will ever be perfect, infallible, unable to be wrong. That's a universal negative statement. Okay? A particular negative statement disconnects ideas incompletely. Some North Dakotans do not read Charles Dickens. That's true of some North Dakotans, but maybe not all of them. So it's an incomplete negative statement. Some chiropractors do not perform vital signs on their physical exams. Well, that's an incomplete negative statement. It's true, right? Can you think of universal negative statements that might apply? Well, if you can, it would have to be true for all subjects in the category at all times. When we say that a statement can be affirmed or denied, we are saying merely that it can be true or false. Negative statements can sometimes be tricky, and we must be careful when we use them to make sure that they are actually saying what we intend them to say. people can get carried away with these general statements, and I see it all the time. This gets back to what you guys said earlier about black and white thinking and the cognitive dissonance that comes from this. My kids are so guilty of this kind of extreme black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking. You always tell me to clean my room. No, I don't always tell you. I sometimes tell you to clean your room. Okay? You really want to make somebody mad, try to clarify the generalities of arguments, especially when they're already upset. Is it the case that I always tell them to clean their room? No. It just feels like it right now because you're angry. But there is a truth of things, and that truth matters, doesn't it? A statement is the linguistic expression of the most fundamental comparison the mind makes when it relates one idea, the subject, to another, the predicate. That's a statement. We call judgment the mental act by which we link ideas in a way that enables us to make coherent statements about the world in which we live. Coherent goes back to the coherence theory of truth. Think about that. We look at three theories of truth: the coherence theory, the correspondence theory, and the pragmatist theory. You guys have to know these. What coherent means in this case is that our words actually match the world as it is. That's what a coherent argument is. You can have a coherent argument. Okay? You can have a coherent argument that sort of agrees with itself, but doesn't correspond with the way the world actually is. Okay, so the argument makes sense, but none of the subjects in the argument actually exist. It's about fictitious creatures or something. Great. Does the coherent argument correspond with reality? That's what we're interested in. Because the judgment is the foundation of the statement, what we have already said about statements applies, by necessity, to judgment. A judgment is sound to the extent the relationship it forges between two ideas reflects a real relationship in the objective world. When you get this, then you have the correspondence theory. So let me just make this as clear as possible. You can have a coherent argument about nonsensical things, about fictitious things. That means that all of the statements within your argument agree with each other. The trouble is that the entire argument itself doesn't correspond with anything in reality. Does that make sense? You have this whole argument that you've made about unicorns. Great. All of the statements within the argument cohere with each other. Fantastic. It holds according to the coherence theory of truth. Wonderful. The only problem you have is that there are no actual unicorns, so it doesn't correspond with anything in the real world. How much value does it have to you at this point? Maybe a lot if your whole purpose is to write a work of fiction about unicorns, but maybe not so much if you're out there in the world hoping to engage with such a creature. Okay? When we get together on Thursday, when we get together next week, we're going to pick up here. We'll go through the rest of the material, and then at the top of the hour, we'll do our quiz. I'll look forward to it. I'll see you guys then. Have a great rest of your week.